Hello and welcome to another chess opening video. So today, the Scotch game versus the Scotch Gambit. For those of you that are not familiar with these openings, I had a viewer that kind of mentioned in the Scotch game, they weren't sure, if they should take this pawn in the center after a capture here, or should they take with the knight, or should they ignore that and develop the bishop? Well, those are two different openings. That's the difference between the regular Scotch game and the Scotch Gambit variation of the Scotch game. So before we dive into that, let's take a look from the beginning and see, how do you even arrive at this position? So after e4 is played and then e5, we have knight to f3. Common opening moves. And then most often you will see knight to c6 being played here. And then regularly, bishop to c4 is probably seen a lot by beginners, even by advanced players. But you'll most often see the bishop moving here to b5, or even to bishop to c4. So these are two different openings. The Italian game or the Spanish game, Ruy Lopez, depending on what you play. Now we're going to look at the Scotch game, which is d4, this move here. So this is the beginning of the Scotch game. And this is probably a good opening that you may want to try, especially for beginners. It immediately opens the position up a little bit. You have plenty of room to develop your pieces. So this is probably a good opening to start with if you're a beginner. Maybe not as complicated as the Ruy Lopez, and even the Italian game can get complicated. But what normally happens here? Well, by far, usually your opponent is going to capture this pawn to prevent you from having two pawns in the center. So now we come to the difference here of this regular Scotch game and then the Scotch Gambit. So most often played 25,000 times versus 5,000, almost 6,000 times is the regular Scotch game. And white, it looks like they win a little bit more, 36 versus 35%, with the regular knight capture here. And black actually wins more often if they play the Scotch Gambit. So it looks like the regular capture here of this pawn immediately is a little bit safer. So I'll take a look at the Scotch game first, and then I'll look at the Scotch Gambit. So normally you would capture here, and then what? The most often played move is to just develop the other knight, attack here, and then after the most played move of capture, you have an option. Capture away from the center, but then the queens could be traded. So normally you capture towards the center. Now this does leave you with a weak isolated pawn that could be a weakness in the endgame. And now you have more pawn islands. 1, 2, 3 pawn islands, and white only has 2. So these pawns could be an endgame weakness. Normally the knight is attacked immediately, but that pawn is pinned to the king. So after queen to e2, the bishop is blocked in, but this pawn is threatening the knight again. So knight develops forward, c4 attacking the knight, but now we have bishop to a6. A nice move, developing a piece, aiming at the queen, pinning this pawn so it can't capture your knight, and now b3 protects the pawn. So here g6 is usually played, and then f4 backing up this central pawn because the bishop is developing, piling up on that pawn, and now the queen is able to step to the side, allowing this bishop to develop. And so knight to b6, because now after the queen moves, there's no longer this pin of the pawn when the queen was on e2 here, and this was lining up on that. So most often played is this move, attacking the queen. So the queen steps forward, and now the king cannot castle immediately to the king side. So knight develops, d6, attacking the central pawn, and white normally castles to the queen side here. Interesting choice. And this move of the pawn also allows black to castle here. So knight to e4, c5, blocking this bishop's scope. And now knight moving forward, attacking the queen. Queen retreats, and the bishop develops here. So it looks like black could capture the pawn, and then after a recapture, there's a possibility of grabbing another pawn here, but black would be left with these weak, isolated pawns. And, of course, the bishop could try and capture in the meantime, attacking the queen and the rook here. So there's a lot going on. Knight to d7, adding more pressure. Capture, and the rook attacks the queen here. So after queen to d8, bishop to b2, knight blocks, wanting to keep this bishop. And this is as far as the game goes. But, interesting play there. So I'd recommend trying this out if you haven't tried out the Scotch game. We'll go back to the beginning once again so I can show you how you arrive at the Scotch game. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, common opening moves, and the Scotch game is this move right here, d4. Now, the most often played move by far is to capture this central pawn, because if, let's say, the second played move is this, just fortifying the pawn, well, then there could be an option of pushing forward, gaining space in the center, and attacking this knight, gaining time and space in the center. So that is why the most common move is to capture here. Now, once again, the regular Scotch game is to go ahead and capture with the knight in the center. And it looks like white does slightly better. It's about even. Looks like there are more draws with that regular Scotch game versus the Scotch Gambit, where this pawn is not captured and the bishop is developed here to c4, which we'll take a look at. But let's cover the regular Scotch game one more time just to make sure there's nothing we missed here. So normally you would capture, and this is the regular Scotch game, not the Scotch Gambit, which we'll look at next. So here we have capture, and the most played move is knight to f6. What else could be played? Well, this is a possibility. You could go here, the third most played move, but then that pawn could just block. A pawn could move up here to c3 and attack the bishop. So more common move is to develop the bishop here. And then most played is to go ahead and help protect the knight with the queen and the bishop together here. And then you have queen to f6, just piling up even more pressure. So c3, blocking the scope of the bishop and protecting this knight. So knight at g to e7. Black is ready to castle. The bishop is developed, and white is ready to castle. So here, normally knight to e5 is played the most often. Black could just castle immediately, but this attacks the bishop. So what does this bishop normally do? Usually it goes down here, which covers these squares, preventing the knight from moving forward, maybe to here in the future, although the queen was covering that anyway. So queen to g6 is normally played, forking two pawns here and castling. So now, this pawn is unprotected. So what is normally played? It looks like when the queen captures on e4, white wins 63% of the time. So I'm not going to dig it, deep into that, because this is kind of an introduction to these openings. Something you could check out if you decide to play this opening yourself and try and analyze it on your own or with the help of the computer. But d6 is normally played because one of your priorities when you're playing the opening and into the middle game is to get your pieces developed in a hurry. So the bishop is able to develop now that this pawn is moved. f3 is normally played now to prevent this queen from capturing here. So castling, king moves out of the line of fire of the queen here, and we have bishop back to b6 because the bishop, if this knight moved, the bishop could be captured here, but let's see what is actually happening. Normally a4 is played, then a6 because you're threatening to push forward and chase this bishop. So now the bishop has an escape hatch. Knight to d2, d5, trying to break the center up here. So a5 attacking, bishop retreats, and an attack on the unprotected knight here. So queen protects, attacking the bishop now, so the bishop retreats, and then knight to g6, dropping back here. But the bishop is able to pick off this pawn, and likewise we have a capture, queen captures, bishop to b6 attacking, and queen stays in a centralized position here. So now the rook kind of lines up on the queen, capture, knight captures, and knight jumps forward here. So bishop up to c4, lining up on the king, bishop blocks, and knight attacks the bishop. So that's ignored, attacking, grabbing a pawn. So capture, an attack on the queen. And that's as far as the game went. So this gives you an idea of how the Scotch game could play out. So now let's take a look at the Scotch Gambit, which after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, protecting this pawn, which was under attack. Now we have d4, adding more pressure to this pawn. So normally you will see the capture here. And now we'll look at the Scotch Gambit, which instead of attacking with this knight, we ignore that pawn and we just develop the bishop and we're ready to castle. So we're behind by a pawn here, but we have two pieces developed and we're ready to castle already. So normally knight to f6 is played. and white chases or attacks the knight. That is ignored in favor of this move, counterattacking the bishop. So generally the bishop moves, pinning the knight to the king here. And now we have knight, which was under attack by the pawn, jumping forward onto this outpost. So finally, the knight captures here. So bishop to d7, helping to stop all this pressure building up on the knight that was pinned and breaking the pin. So most often we have this capture and then the pawn captures. So black is able to keep the bishop pair, but he has an isolated pawn and doubled pawns here. So finally white castles. Bishop develops, adding a little bit of pressure to the knight here. So f3, attacking the knight. We have a knight retreat. And here the knight could swing back here and put more pressure on this knight, which is pinned by the bishop here to the king. So f4, knight jumps back. Bishop to e3, helping guard the knight and kind of break this pin. So a retreat. Knight attacks here. Exchanges are made. And that kind of helped white develop. So, so far white is ahead in development. And generally it's a good idea to try and break the position open if you're ahead in development. So here we have c5. Knight has to retreat. d4. Bishop retreats. The knight repositions, aiming down the long diagonal here at the king side. So an attack on the queen. Queen just jumps forward. And now we have f5. Queen captures. Knight jumps forward. Queen lines up on the king. And rook captures here. So interesting options. An attack on the knight, which is protecting the rook. So rook at a to f1. Oh man. The knight could be captured here. But normally, well, in this game, black won just by castling here. Getting the king safe before trying to go after this material. So the knight retreated. Then we have rook at d to e8, attacking the isolated pawn. The bishop defends. And c4. These pawns are marching down the board. So in this game, e6 was played, which I guess increases the scope of the bishop here. Piling up with the bishop and the rook. The queen just captures here, grabbing material. So we have 5 pawns for white and 6 for his opponent. And his opponent has the bishop pair. So this probably contributed to why black ended up winning here. So queen triples up with the 2 rooks here on the open file. The rook tries to trade material, because black is ahead. So now an attack on the queen. Queen just moves over and they're piling up on this pawn. The rook fights for the open file. So after an exchange, now instead of grabbing this pawn, queen to g4 check was played. The king drops in here to safety. White moves towards the center, and then queen to e5, helping protect this pawn. All right, anyway, I'm not going to go much further, but I recommend you try out the Scotch game, which once again is this regular e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. So instead of developing your bishop to c4 or b5, you immediately push this pawn to d4. So this is the Scotch game. And most often, we see 32,000 times the pawn will be captured, with the second move that is played second most often, d6, is only played 200 times. So normally you'll see this capture. And the regular Scotch game is to go ahead and capture with the knight. But if you want to play the Scotch Gambit, that would be bringing this bishop out here. And we can go through it one more time. Instead of knight to f6, they could play this to try and hang on to the pawn. And then you can add more pressure to it. Looks like best is knight to f6. Well, played most often is knight to f6. And apparently that's how black wins the most, is developing the knight and getting ready to castle. So, what if they take? Well, taking here generally allows white to win more often. It looks like 59% of the time. So we might as well take a look at that. If they try to take, they recommend capturing with check here. King captures, queen to d5 with check. The king moves up to f8, capture with check, queen blocks, and then normally you can just capture there. And after the knight captures, white captures a pawn here. And then it looks like material is what? Even? Both sides have two pawns. Yeah, so here it's even, and after d5, looks like capture, knight, adding more pressure to that pawn. So white just castles and capture here. So after just more exchanges, the rook grabs the open file. Bishop attacks the knight, threatening to maybe capture and break the pawns apart. So the knight jumps forward and attacks the bishop. And that is ignored with rook to e8 because of the threat of a back rank mate here if this knight tries to capture. So white gets rid of that possibility. Now the rooks are protecting each other. So after retreat, rook at a to c1, the pawn's under attack, so it moves forward. And once again, another example of how the Scotch Gambit may play out. If we go back to the Scotch Gambit, which was, see, this position here. So if we go back, after the pawn is captured, you can play bishop to c4 here, the Scotch Gambit. And it looks like, what did we take a look at? Oh, the other possibility, if black plays the second most common move, which is bishop to c5, well then c3 apparently is played most. White could just go ahead and castle. So I might as well take a look at that. But if white castles, he wins a little bit more often. There's less draws, but he loses more often. Looks like black wins more. So I don't know, we could take a look at that. D6, C3, a pin on the knight. Queen ignores that, lining up on this F pawn. So after capture, capture, king moves over and capture, capture, capture. And the pawn pushes forward here with the rook lined up on the king. So queen to e6 is a possibility. Getting ready to capture if that pawn keeps pushing forward. But after an attack on the queen, we have queen to f5, king up to g7, king getting out of the line of fire. The queen develops here, and the rook tries to fight back for this half-open file. An attack on the queen, and a counterattack on the opponent's queen. So after rook captures, anyway, that's as far as this game went. But a lot of interesting possibilities in the Scotch game and the Scotch Gambit. So, feel free to leave comments and let me know what you think of these two openings. If you've tried them before, what you prefer, the Scotch game or the Scotch Gambit variation. Also, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.